Hi everyone, it's Jeanette here from the Sewing Studio with a quick little project here today. It's that time of year where sometimes we just need something quick to do. We've possibly been doing a lot of sewing leading up to sort of the end of the year. And also I always sort of think about what I'm going to need for the year ahead in terms of my sewing. So what I thought I would show you today is this quick little case, and in here I keep my rotary cutters. Now this actually fits my small 28mm and my 45mm, and these are two rotary cutters I take to workshops, you know, if I go on a retreat. So I have a wheelie tote that I keep my sewing machine in, and for many years I just used to have these in a pocket, and I was always very aware that as I was diving my hand into the pocket to get my rotary cutter, that I was potentially putting my hand into a pocket that might have a sharper object in it. So I decided to make a case to, one, protect my hands, but also to provide a little bit of protection for the rotary cutters themselves. So I'm going to show you how to make this little case. So I've done a little bit of sewing ahead of time, and I'm going to bring this in to show you. Now this is just some oddments, and you might recognise the fabric. Anybody that has seen the rail fence quilt tutorial, these are offcuts, bits and pieces that have been left from that quilt, including the fabric we used for the backing and the binding. So I thought, actually, I might as well use up those. So I've been raiding my scrap 2.5 inches, but this is a perfect project for a mini charm. Now for this you need 20 squares, and so you would get 2 from a mini charm. So we've just had a little bit of a look around the shop and pulled out some of our favourites and some examples. I think this was Naomi's favourite, the sort of nice bright ones. So this is called Gradient Aurus, and there's some really nice pops of colour in that one. Of course, I'm getting drawn towards the blues, and this is Janet Clare's Bluebell range, which I think is her latest range. So it's got some nice blues and greens in that one. We have a basic grey. This was a basic grey fabric, but this is a much brighter line. There's some sort of lemons and that looks like apple slices and bits in here. So quite often basic grey will bring out a really sort of bright range of fabric, as well as their more sort of softer muted tones. And then also Kansas Troubles. I love these sort of Civil War type fabrics. So there's just a different selection of sort of different palettes for different people's tastes. But as I said, you would get 2 of these pouches from one mini charm pack. So let's just put those there out of the way. Now I've done a little bit of sewing ahead of time. And all I've done is I've put together 20, in effect 20 2.5 inch squares. I have cheated a little bit there and put a strip. That was an offcut from the backing of the rail fence quilt. So I've actually put a flap there, but that's the equivalent of 2.5 inch squares. So you would need 20, and you lay them out 2 by 10 rows. Now, if you don't want to use and do all that piecing, 2.5 inch squares, you can of course just cut a piece of fabric. 4.5 by 20.5 is the measurement for this. So you can sort of make the outside any way you want, really. But like I say, I use these as projects to use up my spare 2.5 inch squares. And then you want to cut a piece of lining, which is the same width, so it's 4.5 inches, but it's actually just 1/4 inch longer, and I'll show you why that is in a moment. So that will be 20 3/4 inches by 4.5. And then the first thing I do is I make the rounded. Let me just bring this one back in. If you can see, I like to sort of round the edges. Now you don't have to, you can leave that square, that's absolutely fine, but I just like a little rounded edge on mine. Now I always, for years, I just used to draw around a large cotton reel and just trim that away with scissors. But earlier this year, I treated myself to the Creative Grids multi-sized curved corner cutter. I'm reading that off the template. And this just speeds it up, and I just sort of treated myself to this because I make quite a few of these little things with curved edges. So I thought actually it was worth the investment. So I'm actually going to use the 2 inch because you don't want too sharp a curve. We want to give ourselves some nice or some fairly easy sewing. So I'm just going to do, this is my flap end. One other thing I should say before I cut the flap, if you're using all squares, let me bring this one in, you'll see there's sort of 6 rows here, so from the second row down is what you see the most on the front. So if you've got some favourite fabrics you want to put in there with your 2.5 inch squares, they're the ones you're going to see the most. The top 2 not so much because the flap comes down over it, and then the 5th row there starts to sort of curve around the back. Also, if you've got a directional fabric you're using, just be mindful that when you fold that under and come up the back, that will be upside down. So if you've got a directional fabric, you might have to make a seam in the bottom there and sort of flip it round or turn it, or in a square, turn the square upside down when you sew it in. You'll probably only make that mistake once and then realise, oh, I actually need to sort of turn that fabric round. So I just wanted to point that out. So I've chosen some nice fabrics there. So these are going to be the 6 that you sort of see the most. Sorry, no, these, wrong end, these here. So those not so much, those. So I'm going to round the corner. As I said, I'm going to use the 2-inch one, and this has just made it more accurate and speeds up this step for me, because I can just go in now with my rotary cutter and round off that corner. Shall I do that under the close-up? Let's put that in. And let's do it again. And on this one, you just line up the 2 edges, and then I can just go round with the rotary cutter. So it sort of saves me a step, and it gives me a really nice curve to that. And I'm going to do the same with my lining. These are perfect little things for quick little gifts. I've made several for sort of my quilting friends. But also they're really good because, as I said, they use up odds and ends of fabric. Now I have, sorry, let me just do that, can't cut and talk at the same time, which is quite unusual. My report card at school used to say talks a lot. So I've attached the outside to a piece of, this is actually fusible fleece. Look at me picking off threads again. I don't know, they get everywhere. And I actually sewed them together. These were 2 scrap pieces. I've actually had 3 pieces of fusible fleece that I've attached for this, but you can use your offcuts of quilt wadding or anything. And I've just simply quilted it, let me put that under the close-up, with just sort of straight line stitching either side. And there's a little thread there as well. Let's pick that out while we can see it. Either side of the seam, across all of the seams. So you can sort of quilt as much or as little as you want. It doesn't really need to be quilted with the fusible fleece, but I have, just to give it a bit more of a look. So once we've got it to that stage, we're ready to assemble. So all we're going to do is fold those 2 bits together, so it's straight edge to straight edge. And then I'm going to take that to the machine and sew 1/4 of an inch along that seam. So I've just put a couple of pins there. I know you'll all be a bit shocked. I wouldn't necessarily at home, to be quite honest. So we've got our 1/4 of an inch seam there along the edge. This is one of these projects where it's just consistency rather than accuracy. If you're a bit wider than 1/4 of an inch, it's not really going to matter. This is sort of what I call a craft project, so there is some leeway. So we're just going to take that to the iron, give it a press, set that seam first, and then we're going to just fold that back. And you'll see this is where I added the extra, do that with the iron, 1/4 of an inch, because it gives it this little faux bound edge. So it just helps to sort of finish off that edge nicely. So I'm going to take that to the iron and just top stitch, sort of stitch in the ditch as close to that piece there, just to hold that lining down. So you can see there, I've just given it a little top stitch as close to that ditch as I can. The trick with that is just go slowly and take your time. So now you should have something that looks like this with that edge closed. So I'm actually going to flip it over and open it all out, because this is the trick of how this comes together now. We've got no raw edges on the inside. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this edge and we're going to bring it up, fold it up to roughly where we want it. And this is where you can sort of judge how high up you want that to come. Now you might, if you've got a rotary cutter there, you might just want to put your rotary cutter in and make sure you've got enough to fit in. So I'm going to do mine about there. I'm not much for measuring. I sort of do a lot of things by eye. So I'm going to sort of do it like that. And I'm actually just going to fold that out of the way for a minute and put a couple of pins here, because we need to sew together one of the outside edges, because this is where we're going to leave the gap to turn it through when we come to sew the whole thing. So we need to close that outside edge first, otherwise we'd have a hole in the outside. Now, I'm actually going to sort of do it between those 2 points, but you just want to, somewhere in between there is where I'll leave the gap in the lining. So I'm just going to take that to the machine and sew 1/4 of an inch between those 2 pins. So now we should have something that looks like this. So we've got our seam there, which has closed that outside edge, and the rest of our pouch looks like that. So now we just need to do the finishing touches. So I'm going to lay that lining back out so it faces out to the right, and then I'm going to fold that one up so that it comes up to the edge. So that curve should fit. So let me just hold that to the side. So you should see that your pouch has this. So you've got 2 pieces there with the lining together and 2 pieces with the outsides together. So from the side, it looks like that. So I'm just going to put a couple of pins in where we've sewn. So this is where we can leave our gap for turning. And it's there. And you want to do about 3 fingers width, so about 2 inches. I'm just going to check that I've definitely caught that. Yes, and I have. And now we're going to take that back to the machine and we're going to sew to the bottom there, and we want to backstitch at the beginning of the end, and then we're going to sew from there all the way around the flap and round to this pin. Now, one little trick I will show you when it comes to sewing a curve. Now you can measure this, but I sort of do this by eye. Let me actually put a pin in there to help hold that flap down. Is I draw myself my sort of 1/4 of an inch, and I do it by eye. But if you want to measure that and be a bit more precise, you can. But I find that just sort of helps me know where to go when I'm sewing a curve. Because if you get your curve a little bit lumpy bumpy, it will show. And because this is the flap, you will see it. So we want to get as a nicer, smoother line as possible. So there I've just sort of drawn my curves, just echoing, so I can follow that shape. So we're going to take that to the machine and sew all the way around. Excuse me. So I'm going to backstitch. Now this is where that flap is, the piece where we've done the top stitch. So when I get to that bit, I am actually just going to reinforce that by going back and forwards a little bit, a couple of times over that. So I'm just going to lift my foot and straighten that out a little bit. So it's right there, so I've got my finger where that is. Now the trick, now I'm a little bit off my 1/4 inch, but I think I can still got something to follow. The trick with this is to try to keep going in one motion, keep it as smooth as possible, and just take your time. So I'm just lining up the outside of the foot. But I've also got my visual there to give me my curve. Now I'm on the straight, so I can whiz a little bit. And we're coming into the curve, so we're just going to try and sew smoothly. And this is generally where I find I go off more, coming out of the curve rather than going into it. So just take your time. Now we're at that lip again, so I'm going to just sew past it and then back stitch. So you can see there, I probably drew more of a 3/8 of an inch seam. Sorry, finish your sentence first, Jeanette. But it still did give me a visual of what that curve looked like, and I need that. I'm very visual. So at this point, I just check that I'm happy that that is looking nice and smooth. So if we sort of put it under the close-up, and I can see I am. Now, if I'm not happy with it, I might take those stitches out and give it another go, and that's absolutely fine. You can absolutely do that. You don't have to do everything first time and get it absolutely right. So we're ready now to turn it through. So this is where the magic happens. So here's our little gap we've left. And I always think I've left a bigger gap. No, actually, sorry, Jeanette, before you do that, I am just going to clip these corners. Rushing ahead of myself, excited to see what this one looks like. And around the curve, I'm just going to trim it back to about 1/8 of an inch. You don't necessarily, let's see if I can get that word out, need to clip into it. The rule of thumb is clip into an inside curve, but an outside curve, if you clip into it, sometimes it can end up looking a bit lumpy. So I'm just going to thin that curve down just to give me less bulk there. If you've got a pair of pinking shears, you could sort of pink around that edge as well. That works fine. But let's say you just need to thin it down. And then I tend to go far away corner and then just poke it through. And this is why we backstitched when we left that gap, so that we're not popping stitches and making that gap wider. It's surprising how much you can fit through a tiny little gap. Now it will come out inside out. And at this point I just check that it looks like I've caught everything. And it looks like I have. So then now we can turn the whole thing through, and all we've got is a little gap there in the lining that we need to close either by machine, but I tend to do that by hand. It's only a small little couple of inch gap, so I tend to just close it by hand. I find it's a bit easier with these pouches. You haven't got a lot of room to work on the machine. So just a little whip stitch or a ladder stitch or a slip stitch. It doesn't really matter, just you don't really get to see it. Now I need my pokey tool to get down into those corners. And just do that gently. You don't want to poke through your fabric, because we've all done that, haven't we? And that's what it's going to look like. Now I'm just going to pull that edge out a bit more. And if you needed to put your tool on the inside and just get that nice and flat, you can. So I would normally take that to the iron, give it all a good press, just check my seams that I've caught everything on the edges there, and it looks like I have beautifully. And then the final thing after I've pressed it is I would take that to the sewing machine and just do a little top stitch about 1/8 of an inch in, and you just start, you might want to do it from this side, you just start just there on the flap, and I top stitch all the way around and I finish there. Now I'm going to just check my rotary cutter fits in there, and it does beautifully. So that's going to be a really nice case for the rotary cutter, and it uses up all our oddments of fabric, or a nice little mini charm if we've decided to use that. So I'm going to put that one aside for a minute. Let me take the rotary cutter out, because in a minute I'll forget where I've put it. And just flip onto this one just to show you that you can do these in any shape and any size. Same technique. Now this is another little style I make, and I have these in my project pouches when I've got my hand sewing or my cross stitching that I take out and about with me. And in this I can put a little pair of scissors, my spare needles, my beeswax thread conditioner, all little bits and pieces like that. So what I thought I would do with this one is show you how to install the popper. So we're going to add the popper, but if you haven't got poppers, I actually use this tool, and you can see this is a little pouch I made for my tool that puts the poppers in. So that keeps that nice and safe, and also I know where it is. And this is a little tool by Prim, but you can get all sorts of different makes. And this one comes with different attachments here, and you can actually punch the hole to put the poppers in first. But I tend to just put the setting tool pieces in it and just use it for setting. I tend to sort of do a hole with an awl. I have a clover awl that I'll make my hole with, and it just saves swapping over these ends quite a bit. But if you haven't got this, you can close it. You could use Velcro. You could sew some Velcro in. You could do a little buttonhole and put a button. You could put a little loop of elastic into this seam here and have a little button closure with a loop. Or you can have some of those sew-in poppers. So there's lots of different options for doing a closure on this. But I really like these little plastic snaps. They work really well, and they're really quick and simple. So you can sort of see I make quite a lot of these little pouches. So on this one, I'm going to do this under the close-up. I'm going to find the centre, and all I do for that is I'm just going to fold this in half and just sort of finger mark a crease there so I can see it, which is right there. And then I'm going to measure in. I tend to do it about 5/8 of an inch. I don't know why 5/8. 2, 3, 4, 5. If you want to go down to 3/4, you can, but about there. It's going to be, actually, let's go mad and do 3/4. And I'm just going to put a little pen mark right there. Now, I need to grab my snaps. Now, I bought myself a big, and you can see this is a Prim one, a big selection of different coloured snaps. So I'm going to have a look in here. Oh, there's a couple of colours I could use. And I could either use that white, or I could use this sort of beigey one, and I think I'm going to go with that beigey one. Actually, I don't know that that's light enough to be beige. So you want two bits that look like sort of tacks, and then you want one where you've got a recess and one with a bit that sort of sticks out. Now I put that one in the top and that one in the bottom, so let me just do that, our two sets. And I'm going to get my awl, and where I've made that mark, I'm just going to make a hole and go through. And then this one, the one that looks like a little drawing pin, so I should have held that under for a bit longer, goes through, and then this bit goes on top. And then for the setting tool, this bit goes under the back bit there, and that should fit in there nicely. And then literally all you do is give it a little squeeze. And you don't need a huge amount of strength, but a little bit of hand strength. And what that does is it flattens down that little plastic point to hold that snap in. So once I've got that one in, I just fold my flap down. Let's put it more centrally to where I want my flap to close. Now I don't tend to have it so that it's right up against that edge. I tend to give myself a little bit of room there. So if you can sort of see, the lip is there, so I've given myself about 1/4 inch. And that just allows for me to put things into it. And then I'm just going to sort of press down on that, and what that does is gives it a little indent in the fabric. And then I can just go in again, just making sure that I don't poke all the way through the back of this as well. And then this flat bit now goes on the inside. And that bit goes on the outside. So let me just hold that there. And once again, that setting tool goes underneath, that goes on top, and we give it a little squeeze. And we listen for the pop. And once we hear that pop, we know it's set. So I tend to just sort of close it and open it just to make sure I've got that set in. And that's as simple as it is for closing it. Let me just tidy up. So I hope you'll give these a go. Like I say, if you want to make this size, I should just say this uses 18. So you could get the large one and the small one, or the longer one and the short one, out of a mini charm pack. So this uses 18 and it's 3 by 6 rows. But you can see there as well, I've used a little strip to give a little bit of a contrast onto the flap. But they're really useful. I make them, as I said, in all sorts of different sizes. I have one I do for my iPad. I have one which is sized to fit my phone. I just do all sorts of shapes and sizes in these. They're really useful. So I hope you'll give it a go. If you do, please share any of your photos with us. I hope you enjoyed that quick little project. And I hope you'll join us here again next time in the sewing studio.